The day I walked into that courtroom, my daughter rolled her eyes at her husband, as if I were nothing more than an old nuisance who had overstayed her welcome. But then something happened that neither of them expected. The judge, a man I had never met in my life, stopped mid-sentence when his eyes landed on me. The room fell into complete silence. Hannah and her husband Victor froze, their faces draining of color. And then the judge spoke my name with a look of disbelief. "Ms. Reynolds," he said slowly. "You are really here." In that instant, the entire balance of the room shifted. The power my daughter thought she held over me dissolved, and the truth was about to unfold. "My name is Anita Reynolds. I am 70 years old, and for most of my life I believed I was simply an ordinary grandmother living in Austin, Texas. My mornings followed a rhythm as steady as the sunrise. At 5:30 I would put the kettle on and pour steaming coffee into the chipped anniversary mug my late husband Robert gave me on our 30th year together. That mug was never just ceramic, it carried the warmth of his memory into every single day. After coffee, I would slip into the garden shoes Robert left by the back door and step into my small yard. Orchids lined the windowsill, each one blooming under my careful hand. I would water them slowly, watching the first rays of light spread across the kitchen window. Those quiet rituals kept me grounded. They reminded me that even in the simplest of mornings there was meaning, history, and the lingering touch of a man who had loved me well. For nearly 50 years my world revolved around one purpose, raising my only daughter Hannah. I worked wherever I could find a wage. During the day I scrubbed office floors as a cleaner. At night I stitched torn sleeves and hemmed dresses at the small sewing machine Robert bought secondhand for me. On weekends I stood at a corner stall selling tamales and homemade pies, hoping each sale would push us one step closer to giving Hannah the education and future I never had. Robert often reminded me that love is proven in sacrifice, and together we gave everything we had. We celebrated every report card, every graduation, every little milestone like it was a victory for all of us. When Robert passed away, I believed Hannah and I would hold tighter to each other. I imagined Sunday dinners filled with shared grief and tender comfort. I could not have been more wrong. Distance crept in, and warmth began to fade. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Hannah and Victor arrived without warning. Victor walked in first, as if he owned the place, and dropped into Robert's old chair with the television remote already in his hand. That chair had been my husband's spot for decades, worn smooth by his steady presence, and now Victor lounged in it without so much as a greeting. Hannah followed behind him carrying a slim folder. She set it down on the coffee table with a practiced calm that felt rehearsed. "Mom," she began, "this house is too big for you. You cannot possibly maintain it on your own. We have found a wonderful senior residence. They have activities, nurses, and plenty of people your age." I tried to respond, my voice shaking. "But this is our home, Hannah. Every memory of your childhood is built into these walls." Victor did not even glance at me. "Memories are not in walls, Ms. Reynolds," he muttered while flipping through channels. "They are in your head." The words cut through me sharper than any blade. I realized then that their plan was not about safety or care. It was about possession. My house had become their prize. From that day forward, the pressure grew heavier. Realtors began showing up at my door, invited not by me but by Hannah and Victor. They strolled through my living room with clipboards, measuring the space as if I had already been erased. Strangers discussed renovation potential while I stood quietly in the corner, invisible in my own home. Boxes appeared in the hallway, labeled with neat handwriting: donate, storage, trash. My life was being sorted into categories without my consent. Hannah lifted the blue dress I wore to Robert's funeral and placed it into the donate pile as though it had no story left to tell. Then came the moment that split my trust completely. She reached for the small carved jewelry box Robert gave me on our first anniversary. Inside rested a pearl necklace from my mother, a piece I treasured. Hannah slipped the box into her handbag. "This is safer with me," she said softly. It was not safety I saw in her eyes, it was greed. That night the house felt emptier than ever. I sat alone in my bedroom, the silence pressing against me like a heavy weight. Tears rolled down my cheeks, not only for what I was losing but for the daughter I thought I knew. For a moment I felt as though I had already been buried under their plans, dismissed and forgotten. But then something shifted. I wiped my face and looked straight into the mirror. My voice, quiet yet firm, broke the silence. "I will not go quietly. If they want to fight, they will find me ready." The next morning Hannah insisted on cleaning out Robert's office. That room had been left untouched since the day he passed, and it still carried the faint scent of his cologne. When she stepped outside to bring in more boxes, I closed the door behind me and turned the lock. My eyes scanned the bookshelves Robert kept so meticulously. That was when I noticed it. Behind a row of old encyclopedias sat a small square panel, barely visible. My hands trembled as I pulled the books aside. A safe, built right into the wall. I tried every number that made sense. Our wedding date, Robert's birthday, Hannah's birthday. Nothing worked. My chest tightened with frustration until one memory surfaced, the rainy afternoon when Robert and I first met, sheltering beneath the striped awning of a bakery. My hands dialed that date, and to my astonishment the lock clicked open. Inside lay a leather portfolio embossed with Robert's initials. I opened it and froze. Deeds to multiple properties, statements from accounts I had never heard of, and certificates of stock in companies I did not know he owned. In the center was a sealed envelope bearing my name in his handwriting. "My dearest Anita," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have found what I kept hidden. These assets are yours alone. Hannah will only inherit if she cares for you with love and respect. Do not doubt your strength." Among the papers was a deed to the very condominium where Hannah and Victor lived, proof that the place they flaunted as their own was actually mine. And tucked behind that deed were records of shares Robert had quietly purchased in Victor's company, enough to influence decisions about his future. My knees weakened. The power they thought they had over me had already been dismantled years ago by Robert's foresight. 3 days later I sat in the quiet office of Dr. Lauren Pierce, a woman whose reputation for precision and integrity was well known in Austin. She greeted me with a firm handshake and a steady gaze that seemed to weigh every detail without missing a single one. After scanning the documents I had carried in my handbag, she leaned back in her chair with the kind of certainty that steadies a trembling heart. "Mrs. Reynolds," she said, "your husband was extraordinarily careful. Everything here is airtight. The deeds are valid, the investments properly registered, and the letter of intent leaves no room for dispute. Your daughter and her husband cannot claim what is not theirs." Her advice was simple but firm. Sign nothing they place before you. Do not argue with them openly. Let them expose themselves. Meanwhile, we will build your defense. You are not powerless, Anita. You are the rightful owner, and we will prove it. From that day on, I followed Dr. Pierce's instructions with precision. I carried a small recorder in my pocket, capturing every conversation with Hannah and Victor. Their words, once sharp enough to wound, became evidence that would one day shield me. I noted each visit from strangers who walked through my home as though it were already theirs. I photographed the piles of boxes, the labels written in Hannah's neat script: donate, sell, trash. Every item that disappeared became part of my growing file. One afternoon Victor arrived with a man in a pressed white coat. "This is my friend," he said casually, "a doctor who will assess whether you can still live alone." The exam lasted less than 5 minutes. He hardly looked at me before suggesting early dementia. I kept my face calm, though my heart pounded, and quietly switched on the recorder in my lap. That recording, like every other piece of their scheme, was stored in a folder that grew heavier by the week. With each entry, I felt less like a victim and more like a woman preparing for battle. On a Sunday morning, Hannah and Victor drove me across town to see the residence they claimed would be my new home. From the moment we stepped inside, dread pooled in my stomach. The air smelled of disinfectant that could not quite hide the sour scent beneath. The rooms were small, barely wide enough for a single bed and a dresser. Elderly men and women sat slumped in wheelchairs along the corridor, their eyes glazed over with exhaustion. "Look, Mom," Hannah said brightly, "they even have a television room." I peered inside to see a handful of residents staring blankly at a flickering screen. "How much does this place cost?" I asked. Victor waved his hand. "Do not worry, we will sell your house." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. 2 days later, Hannah and Victor arrived again, this time with papers in hand. "Spread these out on the kitchen table." "Mom," Hannah said, her tone sharp but dressed as polite. "Just sign here and here and everything will be settled." A man in a suit stood beside them, introduced as their attorney. His nervous shifting told me otherwise. I pretended to study the pages while the doorbell rang. Victor groaned at the interruption. Expecting one of my neighbors, I opened the door to find Dr. Pierce. Behind her stood a process server and a representative from Adult Protective Services. "Good afternoon," Dr. Pierce said with crisp authority. "We are here in response to allegations of elder abuse and attempted fraud." The man in the suit paled instantly. Hannah froze mid-sentence, her pen dangling above the paper. I slid the recorder from my pocket and set it on the table. For weeks you have pressured me, I said evenly. You have called me forgetful, weak, incapable. Yet here is your husband admitting the stove story was invented. The APS worker examined the boxes already stacked against the walls, half my belongings sorted for disposal. The process server produced a court order forbidding removal of any more property until the investigation was complete. Then I opened the folder Robert had left for me and laid down the deeds, the bank statements, the shares in Victor's own company. Hannah's face drained of color. Victor clenched his jaw, speechless at last. The house fell silent, except for the sound of papers rustling in Dr. Pierce's steady hands. In that moment, the balance shifted for good. They knew I was no longer cornered. I was in control. The following week, Victor reached out through Dr. Pierce, his bravado replaced with uneasy formality. He wanted to negotiate. His proposal was simple. He and Hannah would leave me in peace if I allowed them to remain in their condominium for 6 more months. In return, he promised to return every item taken from my house and to issue a written statement affirming that I was of sound mind. Dr. Pierce looked at me, waiting. I thought of Robert and the years I had sacrificed for Hannah. My answer was calm and measured. I will allow them to stay, but the rent increases by 50%, effective immediately. Victor had no choice but to accept. The man who once sat arrogantly in my husband's chair now found himself paying me for the roof over his head. 2 weeks later, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, Hannah stood there alone, her eyes swollen and her hands gripping 2 cardboard boxes. "May I come in?" she asked softly. She set the boxes on the table and stepped back as if ashamed to breathe the same air. Inside were my jewelry, my photo albums, and the bundle of letters Robert had written me decades ago. "These belong to you," she whispered. "I should never have taken them." I watched her closely. Gone was the polished confidence she had worn beside Victor. In its place stood a woman stripped down to regret. "Ricardo convinced me," she said, her voice cracking. "He told me you were slipping, that you left the stove on, that you could not manage anymore. It was easier to believe him than to face the truth about the man I married." I did not rush to forgive. I let her words hang in the air. "Hannah," I said finally, "you broke something deep, but maybe broken things can be mended if we are willing to do the work." Her tears spilled over as she nodded in silence. In the months that followed, I decided that my pain could not simply sit in silence. With Dr. Pierce's guidance, I established the Robert Reynolds Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to protecting older adults from financial exploitation and abandonment. Our mission was clear: to offer legal aid, counseling, and community support for those who had nowhere else to turn. When I told Hannah about it, I offered her a position. The salary was modest, but the work was meaningful. She would live in the small guest house behind my home, a place she could call her own while rebuilding her life. This was not forgiveness, it was a path forward. Each morning she walked into the foundation office determined, sorting case files, greeting clients, and slowly proving that she wanted to change. Watching her work was both painful and hopeful, a reminder of what she had done but also of what she might become if she chose the harder road toward redemption. One afternoon, a young attorney volunteering at the foundation approached me with a heavy folder. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, "I think you should see this." Inside were surveillance photographs and signed statements from several elderly women. Each story was painfully familiar: property transferred under pressure, bank accounts drained, personal treasures stolen. At the center of it all was a man using a different name, but the photographs were unmistakable. It was Victor. He had resurfaced under an alias, running the same scheme against other widows. The authorities already had an investigation underway, but they needed someone who knew him personally. They needed a witness who understood his methods, his tone, his calculated charm. That witness would be me. The courthouse was packed on the morning Victor's trial began. Reporters filled the back rows, and groups of elderly women sat together in quiet solidarity. Their faces reflected stories too similar to mine. When the guards escorted Victor into the room, he wore a tired suit that did little to hide his arrogance. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on me. For a brief moment I saw fury, then the polished smile he always used to disarm people. When the judge entered, I nearly gasped. Judge Nathaniel Cruz. Decades earlier, he had been a timid clerk when I worked as a secretary in this very building. I remembered bringing him coffee late at night as he studied for exams. Now he held the gavel. When I took the stand and stated my name, his head lifted in recognition. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said softly, almost as if to himself. "You encouraged me once, many years ago?" I told the court every detail. I spoke of the boxes, the false stories about my memory, the attempt to push me into a residence, the discovery of the safe, and the proof of ownership Robert left behind. The defense tried to paint me as confused, but I countered by recalling exact moments from years ago, including the oversized Navy suit Judge Cruz once wore. The courtroom fell silent. My memory, I declared, was perfectly intact. After 3 long days of testimony, the evidence was overwhelming. Recordings, financial statements, and witness accounts all pointed to the same truth. Victor was not a misunderstood man. He was a predator. Judge Cruz delivered the verdict with steady authority. Victor Hale, this court finds you guilty of fraud, coercion, and elder abuse. You are hereby sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with full restitution to your victims. The gavel struck, echoing across the chamber. I exhaled, a weight I had carried for years finally lifting. As guards led Victor away in handcuffs, Judge Cruz glanced at me and offered a small nod. It was quiet recognition, a reminder that small kindnesses often return when most needed. The trial ended, but the work was only beginning. With Victor behind bars, the foundation grew in both reputation and reach. We opened legal clinics in nearby towns, staffed by volunteers who believed no older adult should face abuse alone. We organized social gatherings so that those who had been isolated could find companionship again. In time, we secured funding to create short-term housing for elders forced out of their homes. What began as my personal defense evolved into a mission that touched hundreds of lives. Each new case reminded me of my own journey, but it also showed me that resilience could spread, lighting the way for others who once believed they had no voice. 3 years after the trial, an envelope arrived from the state capitol. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside was confirmation that the Reynolds Act had been signed into law. The bill created stricter safeguards against financial and psychological abuse of older adults, ensuring that no one could so easily be pushed from their home or stripped of their dignity again. At the Foundation's new Hall of Stories, we gathered to celebrate. Faces of those we had helped lined the walls in framed photographs, each with a short caption of resilience. In the center space, they unveiled a plaque with my name. I stood quietly, overwhelmed, knowing Robert's foresight had now become a shield for thousands. At 75 years old, I stood before an audience at the Foundation, wearing the pearl necklace that once belonged to my mother. I looked out at the faces of friends, colleagues, and elders whose lives had been touched by our work. My voice was steady. It is never too late to defend yourself. It is never too late to turn hurt into purpose. Strength does not always come with noise. Sometimes it comes with paperwork, patience, and persistence. I told them that I had nearly lost everything, yet in that loss I found a greater calling. Robert believed in preparing for the future, but he also believed in people. He believed in me. If this story speaks to you, I ask that you share it, tap the like button so others can find it. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. Your words matter, and together we can remind the world that dignity has no expiration date.